It is sometime around the year 300 before the Common Era. A merchant ship is making for the harbor of Piraeus, the port of Athens, and in its hold is a cargo of expensive purple dye, the entire fortune of a trader from the island of Cyprus. The ship never arrives. Somewhere off the coast it is lost. The cargo, the vessel, the wealth, all of it gone to the sea in a single day. The merchant survives. He walks into Athens with nothing, no money, no goods, no plan, a ruined man in a foreign city. And years later, when he had become the most respected philosopher in Greece, he would say of that catastrophe, "I made a prosperous voyage when I was shipwrecked." He meant it. The wreck did not end his life. The wreck was the beginning of it. His name is Zeno. History calls him Zeno of Citium, after the city of his birth, a town on the island of Cyprus, a place of traders and sailors and mixed Greek and Phoenician blood. He was born around the year 334 before the Common Era into a merchant family. And for the first part of his adult life, that is exactly what he was. Not a philosopher, not a sage, a businessman, a dealer in goods following his father's trade, moving valuable cargo by ship around the eastern Mediterranean. His specialty, the sources suggest, was the most precious commodity of the ancient world, Tyrian purple, the rare and costly dye that colored the robes of kings. He dealt in luxury, he dealt in wealth. He was, by every indication, good at it. And then, on one ordinary voyage, somewhere around his early 30s, he lost all of it. The ship carrying his fortune went down. The ancient accounts are brief about the disaster itself. They do not linger on the storm or the rocks or whatever it was. They simply record the result. The cargo was lost. The wealth was gone. Zeno survived the wreck and made his way to Athens, the intellectual capital of the Greek world, but for him, in that moment, simply the nearest large city, a place to wash up. Try to feel the actual texture of that. A successful man, mid-life, mid-career, suddenly and totally ruined. Everything he had built, everything he measured himself by, everything that told him who he was, taken in a single afternoon by an indifferent sea. He arrives in Athens not as a philosopher seeking wisdom. He arrives as a casualty, as a man whose life has just been destroyed, walking into a strange city with nothing left. And here is where the story turns, and the turn is the entire reason this episode exists. In Athens, ruined and aimless, Zeno wanders one day into a bookshop. And to pass the time, the bookseller is reading aloud from a book, an account of the life and teachings of Socrates, the philosopher who had died in that same city some decades before. And Zeno, the wrecked merchant, listens. And something in the description of Socrates, this man who owned almost nothing, who could not be touched by fortune, who was serene in the face of poverty and even of death, something in it reaches the ruined man on a level nothing had reached before. He looks up at the bookseller and asks a simple, desperate, life-changing question. He asks, "Where can I find a man like that? Where do people like this Socrates live now?" And as it happened, a philosopher was passing the shop at that very moment. The bookseller pointed at him and said, "Follow that man." And Zeno did. He got up and he followed, and he never really stopped. The shipwrecked merchant had just become a student of philosophy. Zeno studied in Athens for years, first under the philosopher he had followed from the bookshop, and then under others, sampling the rival schools of the city. And eventually, around the year 300, he began to teach his own synthesis, his own system, built from everything he had absorbed, and everything his own ruined life had taught him. He did not teach in a grand academy. He taught, by preference, in a public, open-air, covered walkway in the heart of Athens, decorated with famous paintings, a structure the Greeks called a stoa, the painted porch. And because he taught in the stoa, his students were called simply the people of the porch, the Stoics. That is the literal, almost humble origin of the word. The most influential philosophy of resilience in human history is named after a covered walkway, a roof and some columns, and the open air. A place a man with no money could stand and think. And here is the question this episode is built around. Why did a ruined merchant build this particular philosophy? Why did the man who had lost everything to fortune construct, of all possible systems, the system that says fortune does not matter? Because that is the beating heart of Stoicism. The idea every later Stoic inherited from Zeno, the dividing line. Some things are up to us, our judgments, our choices, our character, the inside of our own will. And some things are not up to us. Wealth, property, reputation, the body, and the sea, and the storm, and the cargo in the hold. And the central claim, the radical claim, is that genuine well-being, the Greek word is eudaimonia, a flourishing life, depends only on the first column, only on what is up to us, only on virtue, on wisdom, on the soundness of our own character. And everything in the second column, all the wealth, all the status, everything the sea can take, is, in the strict sense, not a true good at all. It is at best what the Stoics called a thing of no ultimate importance to a life well lived. Now sit with why a shipwrecked man would build exactly that. Zeno had measured his whole early life by the second column. His worth was his cargo. His identity was his fortune. His sense of who he was rode in the hold of a ship. And then the sea showed him, in a single afternoon, the truth about that kind of foundation. It showed him that a life built on the second column is a life that can be ended by weather. That if your worth is your wealth, then your worth is, quite literally, at the mercy of the wind. The shipwreck was not just the loss of Zeno's money. It was the violent, total exposure of a lie he had been living, the lie that the second column was solid ground. And so the philosophy he built afterward was, in a real sense, the philosophy of a man determined never to be wrecked again. Not by avoiding the sea, you cannot avoid the sea, but by moving everything that genuinely mattered to him off the ship, by relocating his entire sense of his own worth into the one cargo no storm could ever reach, his character, his judgment, the first column. He did not build Stoicism in spite of the shipwreck. He built it because of the shipwreck. The wreck was the teacher. And I want to anticipate the objection now, because it is the honest one, and you may already be feeling it. This can sound like a wounded man's coping story. A man loses his fortune, cannot get it back, and so constructs an elaborate philosophy explaining that he never wanted it anyway, that wealth does not matter, that the loss was secretly a gain. Isn't Stoicism, at its root, just the most sophisticated case of sour grapes in history? It is a fair challenge, and it deserves a real answer. And here is the answer. The sour grapes man tells himself the lost thing was worthless. Zeno did not do that. He never talked that wealth was worthless or bad, or that the comfortable life was not genuinely preferable to the hard one. He was precise about this, and his precision is the whole difference. Health, wealth, comfort, good reputation. The Stoics called these preferred things. Given a free choice, you would reasonably choose them. They are not nothing. What Zeno claimed was something far more carefully drawn. Not that the second column is worthless, but that it is not the foundation. Not that you should not prefer wealth, but that your flourishing, the actual core of a good life, must not be built to depend on it. That is not sour grapes. Sour grapes denies the value of the lost thing. Zeno fully admitted the value of the lost thing, and then made the much harder, much braver argument that a life must be founded on something the sea cannot reach. He did not pretend the cargo was worthless. He moved his foundations off the ship. The school Zeno founded in that painted porch was unlike the other philosophical schools of Athens, and the differences tell you who he was. He did not, by all accounts, gather a small elite of wealthy young aristocrats. The Stoa was famously more open. Its message reached merchants, foreigners, ordinary people, eventually slaves and emperors alike. It makes sense. A philosophy founded by a ruined foreign merchant, taught in a public walkway anyone could enter, was never going to be a closed club for the comfortable. It was built from its first day for people who needed it, for people for whom fortune was a real and present danger, not an abstraction. And the man himself, Zeno, the sources describe with a kind of affectionate precision. They tell us he was tall, thin, and somewhat severe-looking, that he was famously frugal, that even after the school made him respected and he could have lived comfortably, he kept living simply, eating plain food, drinking little, owning not much. The merchant who had once dealt in royal purple now dressed plainly and wanted little. They tell us he disliked large crowds and showy display, that he would walk with only a few companions at a time, that he was modest, that he had a dry wit, that he was not a performer. And they tell us repeatedly that the Athenians came to trust him completely, so completely that the city, which was not his city, remember, he was a foreigner, a Cypriot, an outsider to the end, publicly honored him. They praised him by official decree. They valued him as a moral example to their own young people. They gave him, the shipwrecked outsider, the keys to their walls. A man who had arrived in Athens as a penniless casualty became, over a long life of teaching, one of the most honored figures in the city. And I want to draw out what that arc actually demonstrates, because it is the philosophy proving itself in the life of its own founder. Zeno lost the entire second column in the shipwreck. The wealth, the security, the cargo, the identity, gone. And the life he then built, the genuinely good and honored and flourishing life, he built entirely out of first column materials, out of his own character, out of decades of disciplined thinking, out of the integrity that made a foreign city trust him with its young, out of the wisdom he accumulated and gave away freely in a public porch. None of that could have been lost in a shipwreck, because none of it was ever cargo. Zeno's whole later life is the demonstration of his own central claim. The sea took everything he had once thought he was, and it turned out that the things the sea could not take were enough. Not just enough to survive on, but enough to build a great and honored and deeply meaningful life on. He is the first and best evidence for his own philosophy. The wreck took the second column. The first column was sufficient. I want to slow down now and sit directly with the line at the center of this episode. The thing Zeno is supposed to have said about his own catastrophe. I made a prosperous voyage when I was shipwrecked. It is a startling sentence. And it is exactly the kind of sentence that, taken carelessly, becomes the most toxic version of this philosophy. The version that says every disaster is secretly a blessing, that you should be grateful for your suffering, that the wreck was good. So I want to be very careful and very precise about what Zeno did and did not mean. Because he did not mean that the shipwreck was good. And the difference is the whole episode. The shipwreck was not good. It was a genuine catastrophe. Zeno lost real wealth, suffered a real terror at sea, endured a real ruin, and walked into Athens in real distress. The Stoics never asked anyone to call a disaster a gift, and they never pretended loss did not hurt. To do so would be a lie, and Stoicism, at its honest core, despises that lie. What Zeno's sentence actually claims is something narrower and far more interesting. He is not saying the wreck was good. He is saying the wreck was the occasion of a good. The shipwreck was the event that stripped him of the second column so completely, so violently, that he was finally forced to discover the first. As long as the cargo was in the hold, as long as the fortune was intact, Zeno had no reason to ask what a human life is actually founded on. The comfortable do not ask that question. They have no need to. The wreck destroyed his comfort, and the destruction of his comfort destroyed his ignorance. It forced the question. And the question led him, through that bookshop, to the answer that became his life's work. So the prosperous voyage was not the shipwreck. The prosperous voyage was the philosophy, the wisdom, the school, the honored life, the discovery of the unsinkable cargo. And the shipwreck was simply the storm that drove him, against his will, into that harbor. Here is the image I want to leave you with, because I think it is the truest way to hold what Zeno understood. Every human life is a merchant ship, and every one of us loads cargo into the hold. The question, the only question that finally matters, is what kind of cargo. If you load the hold only with second column cargo, with wealth, with status, with the good opinion of others, with comfort, with the particular shape of a life going to plan, then you have built a ship that the sea can sink. And the sea, sooner or later, sends a storm to every ship. That is not pessimism. That is simply the weather report for being alive. But there is another cargo. There is a cargo made of first column goods, of character, of wisdom, of integrity, of the disciplined use of your own mind. And that cargo has a strange and wonderful property. It does not sink. You can lose the ship and still have it. You can be wrecked, washed up, stripped of everything in the hold the sea could reach, and walk out of the surf still carrying, completely intact, the only cargo that was ever genuinely yours. So let us ask the question directly. What is ruin? What actually happens to a person when the ship goes down, when the career ends, when the fortune is lost, when the marriage fails, when the identity a person spent decades building is suddenly, totally gone? The ordinary understanding of ruin is simple and grim. Ruin is the loss of the things. You had wealth, now you do not. You had a position, now you do not. You had a life of a certain shape, now the shape is gone. Ruin is the empty hold. And Zeno's philosophy offers a different, stranger, and I think truer account of what is actually happening in that moment. Zeno would say, in a so-called ruin, you have not lost yourself, you have lost your scaffolding. Most people, most of the time, do not actually know the difference between who they are and the second column structures their life is currently resting on. The wealth, the title, the role, the routine, the network, the plan. These things surround a person so completely for so long that the person comes to mistake the scaffolding for the building. They think the scaffolding is them. And then the storm comes, and the scaffolding is torn away. And there is a moment of pure terror because it genuinely feels like the self is being destroyed. It feels like annihilation. But Zeno's claim, and he had stood in exactly that surf, so he had the right to make it, is that the scaffolding is not the building. The self is not the second column. And when the scaffolding is stripped away, what is actually revealed is not nothing. What is revealed is the building, the real structure, the first column self, the character and the judgment and the will, which was always the load-bearing thing and was merely hidden all those years behind the scaffolding it did not actually need. This is why Zeno could call the wreck a prosperous voyage without lying and without denial. The wreck did not destroy him. The wreck revealed him. It tore away everything that was not actually him, the cargo, the fortune, the merchant's identity, and left standing the thing that was. And here is the part that matters most for anyone listening who is standing in their own surf right now, washed up and certain they have lost everything. What the wreck reveals can then be built on. That is the entire promise of this philosophy. Zeno did not just stand in the ruins and observe that his character had survived. He took that revealed, unsinkable self and he built a school, a body of teaching, an honored life, a legacy that would shape the world for 2,000 years. The ruin was the clearing of the ground, and on the cleared ground, on the bare first column foundation the storm had exposed, he built something that no second column life he could have lived as a merchant would ever have come close to. Ruin, in Zeno's understanding, is not the end of a life. It is the brutal, unwanted, and sometimes necessary stripping away that shows a person, often for the first time, what they were actually made of, and therefore what they actually have to build with. And I have to be honest about the hard edge of this, because there is one. It is easy to tell this story about Zeno, because Zeno's story ended well. He had the talent and the years and the good fortune of that bookshop, and a great philosophy came out of his wreck. Not every wreck produces a Stoa. Some ruins are just ruins, and some people are crushed by them and never build anything again. And it would be a cruelty to imply otherwise. So let me be exact about what Zeno's example does and does not promise. It does not promise that your ruin will become a triumph. The outcome, whether something great is eventually built on the cleared ground, that depends on time and circumstance and fortune, and is not fully yours to command. What the example does promise is narrower, and it is enough. It promises that the wreck cannot reach the first column, that whatever the sea takes, it cannot take your character, your judgment, your capacity to choose your response, unless you hand those over yourself in despair. Zeno's guarantee is not that you will rebuild gloriously. It is that you will walk out of the surf still in possession of the only tools rebuilding is ever done with. What you then build and how large, the future will decide. but that you still hold the tools. That is certain. The sea was never able to reach them. So how does a person actually use this before the shipwreck or in the middle of one? Because the worst time to discover what you are founded on is the moment the foundation is being tested. And Zeno's philosophy underneath the dramatic story is a practice, and it is concrete, and you can begin it on an ordinary day with no storm anywhere in sight. First, take an honest inventory of your hold. Sit down in a calm hour and ask the question Zeno's wreck forced on him. What, specifically, is my sense of my own worth currently resting on? Be ruthlessly honest. If I lost my income, would I still know who I am? If I lost my role, my title, the work I am known for, what would be left? If the good opinion of others were withdrawn, if the plan I have organized my life around fell apart, how much of me would go down with it? You are not doing this to frighten yourself. You are doing it to find out in advance, in the calm, how much of your cargo is the kind the sea can take. Most people never run this inventory until the storm runs it for them. Run it yourself first. Second, deliberately load the unsinkable cargo. Once you have seen how much of your worth is riding in a vulnerable hold, you can begin, on purpose, to build up the other kind. This is the daily work of the first column. It is the practice of becoming someone whose sense of their own worth rests increasingly on things the sea cannot reach, on how you actually treat people, on the integrity of your choices, on the steady use of your own mind, on whether you are becoming wiser and kinder and more honest. These are not consolation prizes for after a disaster. They are the genuine cargo. And the strange gift of building them is that they pay you in two ways at once. They make an ordinary, unwrecked life genuinely better. And they are also, simultaneously, the exact thing that will still be standing if a storm ever does come. You are not building a disaster kit. You are building the better part of a normal life, which also happens to be the only part a disaster cannot sink. And third, if you are in the surf right now, take Zeno's actual first step. When his ship went down, Zeno did not immediately build a philosophy. He was a wrecked and aimless man for a while. His first real step, the one that changed everything, was smaller and humbler than that. He walked into a bookshop, and he listened, and he asked a question. Where can I find a person who knows how to live like this? That is the step. If you are ruined right now, you are not required to rebuild the whole structure today. You could not, and Zeno did not. You are required only to do the next small first column thing, to ask the honest question, to go and find the wisdom or the example or the person who can show you how a life is founded on something the sea cannot reach. Zeno's entire towering legacy began with a ruined man swallowing his pride and asking a stranger in a shop for help. The cleared ground does not have to be rebuilt in a day. It only has to have its first stone laid. And the first stone, very often, is simply the decision to go and learn how. It would be dishonest to end without naming the danger in Zeno's story, because this episode could be misheard very easily as a kind of romance of catastrophe, as the claim that ruin is wonderful, that you should welcome the shipwreck, that loss is the secret door to greatness and you ought to be glad when the storm comes. That is a misreading, and it is a harmful one, and Zeno would have rejected it completely. Zeno never went looking for his shipwreck. He did not sink his own ship to find enlightenment. He was a competent merchant doing competent work, and the disaster happened to him against his will, as disasters do. He would have vastly preferred, in the moment, for the ship to arrive safely. The Stoics do not teach you to seek out ruin, They teach you something much more sober and much more useful, that ruin, which you did not seek and could not prevent, need not be the end of you. That the storm, when it comes uninvited, finds you already carrying a cargo it cannot take. There is a world of difference between those two ideas, and the difference is everything. One is a reckless glorification of disaster. The other is a quiet, hard-won preparation for it. Zeno's life does not tell you to want the wreck. It tells you to build, in good weather, the kind of self that can survive one. Prefer the safe voyage. Work for the safe voyage. Be glad, genuinely, when the ship comes home. But load your hold all the while with the cargo that floats, so that if the worst day ever does come, you walk out of the surf still holding everything that was ever truly yours. That is the teaching. Everything else is commentary. Zeno of Citium taught in his painted porch in Athens for decades, and he died there, an old and deeply honored man, around the year 262 before the Common Era. The Athenians, who had taken in a penniless, wrecked foreigner, buried him with public honors at the city's own expense as one of their own. And the philosophy he built in that porch did not die with him. It passed to his students and their students and onward across centuries and empires until 300 years later and 1,000 miles away, a Roman slave named Epictetus would teach it, and a Roman emperor named Marcus Aurelius would write it by lamplight in a tent. Every figure this channel has sat with traces back, in the end, to the man who washed up in Athens with nothing. And that is why Zeno belongs at the foundation of this channel. Because his life is the origin of the dividing line itself, and his life is also its first and purest proof. He measured himself once by a cargo in a hold. The sea took the cargo and showed him the lie. And in the ashes of that ruin, stripped down to the first column, he discovered the cargo that does not sink, and built on that foundation alone a great and honored life and a philosophy that has outlasted the empires that adopted it. He is the merchant who lost everything the sea could reach and found in the losing everything it could not. And you do not need a shipwreck to use this. You only need to be a person who, in some calm hour today, with no storm in sight, sits down and takes the honest inventory of your own hold. Asks what your sense of your own worth is actually resting on, and how much of that cargo is the kind a storm could take. And then begins deliberately, in good weather, to load the other kind. The character, the judgment, the integrity, the unsinkable cargo, so that if the worst day ever comes and the ship goes down, you walk up out of the surf, still carrying, whole and intact, the only thing that was ever truly, unconditionally yours. Stone and iron. Thank you for sitting with this one. If essays like this are useful to you, the channel is here for them. Subscribe if you want more.